Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next presenter from Deloitte Digital, Director Simon Stefanoff, to the stage.
All right, can everybody hear me? Very good. So in 2015, I found myself in San Francisco for work at the time, and I had the chance to use the Amazon Alexa Assistant for the first time. Now, this is an area that's always sort of been a passion of mine. I loved Knight Rider growing up. I used to drive my parents mad by trying to talk at the car and get it to do things. So when I encountered this device, I thought it was incredibly magical. And having the chance to use it and find that it actually worked the way that people sort of said it would work was a really magical experience for me. And I had the chance to observe other people using it as well, and I could see the magic in their face too. So I think this quote's really relevant to this conversation. We're talking about AI and particularly voice and sort of the role for brands and marketers. And you know, it's always been one that's been a favourite of mine to discuss sort of the point of technological innovation that we find ourselves in now. And just yell out if you know it. Does anyone know who said this quote? Or wrote it, by any chance? No? Well, it was Arthur C. Clarke. So this is sort of commonly known as the third of his three laws. And you can see him there. He's a very sophisticated fellow. He's a very intelligent fellow. And it's a great quote. What about this one? The thing with magic is it quickly stops being magical. Does anyone know who said that? That one was me, actually. Now, granted, I don't have the gravitas of Arthur C. Clarke, or Sir Arthur C. Clarke, as he's properly titled. And you know, if we go back, for example, there he is in his den. He's got a bunch of books behind him. He's holding a book. He's explaining something to someone clearly in that photo. You know, that's a very sophisticated look. This photo was taken in a weird little island off the coast of England called the Isle of Sheppey. It was very early in the morning on my stag or bucks weekend. For some reason, my best man thought that would be a great place for a bucks weekend. It was an odd place. It was an odd time. But all of that aside, it still doesn't make my quote any less valid, because what's happening today is, particularly with these new technologies around AI, voice, and AR and VR, things like this, people kind of get caught up in the magic. And the reality is that customers, users, no one cares. They just care about value. So, you know, the thing is that magic will have people using, say, an experience or, you know, interacting with your brand once, maybe twice, but then you've got to be delivering something of value. And lots of people are using these technologies at the moment, and they're just missing that. So my aim here is to help you sort of avoid that for yourself and your clients. So, you know, whenever we talk about AI in particular, people worry that, you know, the robots are coming to take our jobs. But really what's happening is the robots are coming to help us with our jobs. And, you know, there's lots of examples of this idea of technology automating tasks, not automating jobs. And, you know, the one that's referenced up there is ATMs and bank tellers. So everyone thought when ATMs came in, that's the death of the bank teller. But the reality is, when ATMs came in, they took away sort of the drudgery of handing money across a desk. And they also meant that it was cheaper to open a bank branch because you only needed a couple of people to do it. So more bank branches opened, which meant that there were more bank tellers. So there are actually more bank tellers after the introduction of ATMs than before. And that's a really kind of good way of understanding the role that technology is going to play. And you know, when you look at AI, it's already automating some tasks in roles that you probably have today. So sentiment analysis with brands, for example. So AI algorithms can now keep track of all the social media channels, not only detect when positive and negative mentions of brands are coming up, but also sarcasm, which was something that people thought, even just a little while ago, that humans would be needed for. You know, if you're a forward-thinking brand, you're probably doing some degree of multivariate testing, so where you've got a control example of, say, a screen or an email, for example, and then you run tests. You create different versions of it and you see which one performs best and you optimize based on that. So with AI, you can now do that on an enormous scale. So you can do hundreds of variations, all programmatically determined, and it tracks which ones work so you can get the optimal engagement. Now, could I get a show of hands? Who here has anything to do with email marketing as part of their role or works for a brand that does? Okay, now keep your hands up if writing email subject lines is your favorite thing to do. Does that just like get you out of bed and blows your mind about how lucky you are to have that job? So there's a startup in the UK called Phrasey that are using AI to tackle this as well. So it's emotive language generation. So they create a language model based on your brand messaging and the way you typically talk to customers. And then it allows you to create a campaign, give it sort of a control, the type of subject line that you would typically use. And then the AI goes away and creates potentially hundreds of versions and variations. And they all get sent out, they get tracked, and it gets optimized over time based on how those open rates go. And the one that's probably most relevant to what we're going to talk about today is this idea of high-frequency customer inquiries. But it's not just that, it's also about creating new customer experiences. That's a really important point of this technology. So there's lots of people who are working in this field. It's quite early days, but there's still a lot of people experimenting with it. And the US government has been running a trial sort of over the last 12 months, and it's based on this notion. This guy's the head of this program around emerging citizen technology. And it deals with this that you're probably familiar with. 70% of interactions with brands, I would say, calls to call centers is one aspect, but even any time you're interacting with a brand, it's sort of asking the same 10 questions. We know from some clients that's as high as 80% asking the top 15 questions. And if you can hand those over to an automated assistant or AI, then you free up humans to do that more high value work, much like we talked about with the bank tellers. Now, one of our clients actually, when I was speaking to them about the work we were doing with them in this field, they're going very aggressively into conversational AI, and my apologies they couldn't appear with me here today. That was always the plan. But I sort of said, well, are you talking to your call center about this? Are you talking to the people who are on the front line of your customer experience? They said they were, and those people were really looking forward to this technology being rolled out. So they weren't scared about it taking their jobs. What they were interested in was it taking away the drudgery of answering those repeated questions, because they're not the things that get them up every day and give them job satisfaction. So the ability to free them up to do the more higher value work, the more sort of human tasks, is seen as a positive thing by them. So let's talk about voice, because this is one that is really going to impact brands and marketers. So by voice, I mean Amazon Alexa, Google Home, any of these sort of what we call voice-first devices. And you can see some statistics up there. They've had a huge adoption growth rate. It's actually been faster than smartphones over the same period, which is about 3 years since the time of launch. And you'll notice that figure in the middle, the second one there, 74% have been bought in the last 12 months. There's a massive uptick in the adoption rate. And it's kind of indicative of leaving this early adopter phase and going into mass adoption. The last figure on the end, 5%, is pretty relevant to Australia because that's the current kind of guess at the moment. It's been the first report that we've had on what the uptake of voice-first devices, these smart speakers, have been in Australia. And the thing to note there is that in the US, it took 3 years to get to 7% of people over 18 years old. And in Australia, it looks like we've hit 5% within a year. And you'll notice the 18% figure from the US is sort of that gap between the third year and the fourth year. So it has sort of a massive uptick. It really has that hockey stick type curve when it comes to adoption. And this is important because people are using them for voice commerce and they're bypassing other traditional channels. So, we know 36% of owners of these devices in the US regularly purchase with voice. It's predicted to be a $40 billion market by 2022, up from $2 billion last year. And there's an advantage for customer experience. There's been a 25-point NPS advantage in the US amongst smart speaker owners for brands that actually have an experience and deliver a good experience. And the kicker on the end there was in a survey that was done, I think, towards the end of last year, over about 2,000 owners of these devices in the US, 41% said that they would use voice over mobile or web in the next 3 years if they could, just because it takes the friction out of those interactions. But the reality of all of this is that, yes, you can deliver frictionless experiences with this technology, but it doesn't come for free. And it's not just in the home that this is happening. I'm not going to dwell on this one, but voice in the car, I think, is going to be huge over the next few years. All of these manufacturers are doing something with either Google Assistant or Amazon Alexa. Voice in the car has always been a crap experience because it's not connected. It has to sort of process voice on this tiny little chip, but in this sort of connected world where all the processing is done off in the cloud, it can be far more powerful, and we're starting to see this roll out. Google, of course, playing with Android Auto in this space, and Amazon doing a tie-in with Panasonic to ensure that when they build in-car entertainment systems, there's a voice assistant at its heart. And I've been running some experiments with this sort of from about Christmas onwards with an aftermarket device to bring Alexa into my car. And interestingly, I'm far more comfortable having conversations in my car than I am even in my home. So I think this is going to be a huge opportunity for brands, marketers, both in terms of allowing interactions with brands that people would do via other channels, but also branded content, I think is going to be a huge opportunity. But the reality of this is that it's not just in the car and in the home. Voice is rolling out everywhere. You've got headphones coming out now that have a voice assistant built in. You've got smart watches that have the Google Assistant built in. Amazon Alexa's being included into all manner of devices. So the reality is that this is going to kind of roll out as this always-on channel, this ambient computer that customers can access in the background, and they're going to expect brands to be there. But it's not just marketing and brands that I want to focus this on. When you actually combine these two technologies, AI and voice, you can do some things that are really, really powerful, and here's an example of one of those.
Even in modern hospitals, the primary alert system between a patient and nurse is a light and a bell. That can mean anything. It's a system that fails to acknowledge or prioritize a patient's needs, which leads to staffing inefficiency, extra stress on nurses, and in serious cases, this can be the difference between life and death. To change this for the Prince of Wales Hospital, we thought we'd put a nurse bedside 24/7. So say hello to voice-activated bedside assistants, the next generation in hospital care, powered by natural language processing and machine learning.
Alexa, tell the nurse I'm in pain.
Deloitte Assist understands a patient's spoken request.
Can you tell me where you're feeling the pain?
Prioritizes and allocates it,
They'll be with you shortly.
ensuring the right help comes sooner. Deloitte Assist collects data from each patient's request to understand future patients' requirements. Using these insights, hospital management can match the right staff to the right shifts. In initial testing, Deloitte Assist has significantly reduced response times against industry benchmarks, while increasing time for care. And Deloitte Assist doesn't just look after patients.
The nurse knows straight away what the patient needs.
Instead of having them to make them do 2 or 3 trips, they can come and just do the one and go attend to someone else.
It's innovation in patient care so that we can give the best care possible for our patients.
There's too many examples in healthcare where we've rolled out systems that actually make it more complicated for our staff to care for patients. This is immediately an example that's made our staff's life easier and our patients' life easier.
Deloitte Assist. Care that's always there.
So that's a pretty powerful example of where we're completely changing the way that services are delivered and completely changing an experience. And with this world comes a variety of challenges for brands. This is just a few of them. I had a few more up there, but in the interest of time, we'll just deal with these ones. So, the reality is that these smart speakers are what I like to call the God bot, right? Whenever a customer talks to them, before they get to your brand, they have to go through the intermediary. So they're either dealing with Amazon or Google. And so it's your role as brands and marketers to be convincing the algorithms, Amazon and Google, that your brand, your client, is the best placed to actually surface that request. And there are some interesting challenges with that, but some tips that I'll get to. Now, customer expectations of natural interfaces are huge. We've all been speaking since we were 2 years old. We know how a good conversation sounds. So when we don't encounter one, it's very, very jarring. And this is a common issue when you see brands rolling out voice experiences on both Amazon and the Google platforms, actually. And then this idea of what is branding in a non-visual world. This is a big challenge as well. So Scott Galloway, who I'm sure most of you will probably know, NYU marketing professor, sort of phrased this challenge to kind of all the brands and said that out of any question for brands this year, this is his big one. Can you afford not to have a voice strategy? Can you afford for the likes of the Amazons and the Googles to be that gatekeeper in between you and your brand? So let's look at how we talk about voice strategy. So we look at it as having 3 pillars. So the first is voice search. Now this is a common one. This is one of those hot items that everyone wants to talk about, but it's far bigger than that. There are branded customer voice apps as well. So Amazon Alexa skills, Google Assistant actions, and then of course there are partnerships, commercial deals that you can do with these providers to ensure that you're getting surfaced on them. But we're going to look at this voice search first because it's one that lots of people talk about and everyone's keen to understand. And the big issue with this is that previously we've had a world where there's been pages of results, and you need to be on that front page of results from a digital point of view. But what do you do when there's only one result? So when I ask a question, it's going to give me one answer. So how do I make sure that my brand, my client's brand, is there and not the competitors? Well, let's have a look at what actually happens when we do a voice search and how it gets surfaced up. So if it can, in Google's case, they will surface it from what they call their knowledge graph. And yes, I'm a Fremantle fan, so Nat Fyfe is my Lord and Saviour. And basically, if it can surface it from there, it will. And the knowledge graph is this human-curated version of data that Google's kind of constantly growing. So I'm going to give you that example now. This is a screenshot, obviously, of me doing the Google search online, but let's hear what happens when I actually ask it over voice. Hey Google, who is Nat Fyfe?
According to Wikipedia, Nathan Fyfe is a professional Australian rules footballer playing for the Fremantle Football Club in the Australian Football League.
Now that might be pretty small, but you can tell that it's the first line of that knowledge graph entry on Wikipedia. And something to note about that is that if there's a question that your brand, you think you want to position your brand to answer, and it's a who, a when, and potentially a sort of a general knowledge what, Google will probably take that space. It's probably not a space that you want to play in or spend any time paying attention to. So what's the other one? What's the one that brands have more control over? Well, when I ask a more sort of bizarre question, if you like, this was a question that my son blurted out over the dinner table the other day. He said, I've got a question. And I said, yeah, fire away. And then he asked Google. And this is the result that we got. So that made me curious, and I was like, okay, well, what happens when I search for that online? And sure enough, I see a snippet here, which is quite representative of what happens over voice. So let's try that. Hey Google, where did samurai live?
On the website japan-guide.com, they say, the samurai were the warriors of pre-modern Japan.
So this is sort of the opportunity for brands. This is where it gets far more relevant. This is your chance to take that spot. So when a customer asks a question, if you can position yourself in what we call position 0, that's above any of these other search results, then overwhelmingly, 8 or 9 times out of 10, the result that's read out will come from this snippet. And this is programmatically determined, but Google sort of provides some hints on kind of how it determines what it is that it's going to use as a response. So if you want to go away and Google this, they've released some voice search guidelines towards the end of last year. And it looks at it from a couple of different dimensions. So it looks at your content and says, okay, well, does this content answer the question? And it uses a rating from fully meets the answer to the question to fails to meet the requirements. And it can, there's, that's a spectrum. So you could sit right in the middle with something that sounds actually quite legitimate. The example we always use for this one is if I ask the question, who's the Prime Minister of Australia? Then your content could answer that based on, well, the Prime Minister of Australia is the highest office of a public official in Australia, blah, 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 and talk about the position of the office. Technically correct, but it doesn't actually really meet the requirement. What they're actually looking for is, it's Malcolm Turnbull from the Liberal Party, and he was elected in whatever year he was elected in. It feels like a long time ago. And then the second dimension of this is speech quality. It's got to be short, it's got to be sharp. This is voice. You can't, there's no way that anyone's going to listen to a large stream of text and still remember what happens at the start. That's when we get back into these old days of telephone IVR menus where you can't remember the first option when you get to the last one. And then it looks at things like formulation, are they correct sentences, and elocution, is it grammatically correct? So the third way that it can respond is it can do a handoff to a branded app or a suggestion of a branded app. And Tide in the US have done a really good job of this. They've taken, the idea of getting stains out of clothing, and they've owned that, and they've created an Amazon Alexa skill based on that. So that when you're in the US and you say, Alexa, how do I get a grass stain out of a shirt? It says, all right, well, I've got a skill for that, Tide Stain Remover. Do you want to listen to it? You say yes. And I know from experience it says, all right, we've got this. There are 3 things you need to do. First thing is blah, the second thing is, and one of those is always going to be, insert Tide laundry detergent here, just coincidentally. So this is early days for this in Australia, so there's not a lot of examples of this. But one that I can show you is Health Direct, the government health organisation, have a skill and an action, on the Google Home platform called Summer Health. So when you ask a question about summer, you get directed to the app. So let's try that. Hey Google, what's the UV rating today?
Okay, you might like talking to Summer Health. Would you like to give it a go?
Yes, please.
Sure. Here's Summer Health. If you tell me your closest major city, then I can tell you the UV rating near you.
Melbourne.
The UV index is 1.7 in Melbourne. The UV index reading is 0.
Hey Google.
Is low danger from the sun's UV
Hey Google.
for the average person. If you could easily.
That'll take care of it. But yeah, you get the picture. So this is something that brands can kind of do. You can look to own a particular request that customers have, that you have some authority in, and you can provide an actual experience for that. The crux of it is really this. Because if you don't get surfaced up for any of these suggestions and you're not found in voice search, then your customers have to ask for the brand or for your client's brand. And so the question is this: do your customers love the brand enough to ask for it? And there are things I think that are going to come from this. I think campaigns are going to sort of start to be far more brand name heavy, but focused around ask for this brand. Because in the Amazon Alexa ecosystem, for example, if you're Sorbent and you're selling paper towels, and I run out of paper towels, I say, Alexa, order me paper towels. Sure as hell isn't going to give me Sorbent. It's going to give me Amazon private label. And I'll have to say, no thanks, I want Sorbent paper towels. So that's going to be a really important thing in the future. So let's look at what it is from these branded apps that make them useful. And really it starts with a customer expectation. So customers expect 3 things from a voice experience, and that's it's quick, it's convenient, and it allows some degree of multitasking. That's why people use voice over these other channels. And quite often you see when people put out Alexa skills or Google Assistant actions or try to play in this space, they completely violate these, either through bad design, not understanding how to actually get people conveniently through to the end, and to achieve what they want them to do, or they just make it sort of difficult to use. It's got to be convenient. It's got to be quick. You can't sort of say to someone, please let me know your 16-digit number that's on a bill that you've got somewhere. It's just not going to work. They'll do that via an existing channel. And you've got to create unique value. This is something that sort of is also an issue at the moment. is a lot of people are taking an experience that they might have had on mobile or on the desktop, for example, some other digital experience, and saying, let's put it up on voice and let people use this experience with voice. And as I mentioned at the start, yeah, that might be all right for the first couple of times. Customers think, well, this is a bit of a gimmick. I can do this via voice. But unless you're creating some sort of unique value, unless you're providing an experience that they can't get in any other channel, or you're making it significantly easier and hitting those 3 customer expectations, people just aren't going to use it. And the app stores of both of the major platforms, you know, the Alexa Skills Store and the Google Assistant directory, are riddled with apps that people aren't using, that either no one's used or a few people have used, they've got bad reviews, and it's for all those reasons that I've already mentioned. This is the way we talk to people about understanding what you can use voice for, what voice is really good for, and what traditional channels are good for. Because despite what anybody says, this isn't going to kill any traditional channels. It's going to provide an extra one for people to use when the time's right, when they want something quickly and conveniently. So, you know, on the left here, we've got this notion of browsing, right? Info on a broad subject, or a lot of information. And that's great for existing channels. You've got the desktop web where a lot of people do research, and you can, you know, most people when you look at their browsers have 30 tabs open and they're, you know, looking at all kinds of things, and they themselves are the filter. That's absolutely fine when you've got it on a screen. With voice though, it doesn't work. And if you want a sort of an example of this, think of what the first thing that someone says to you before they give you a phone number if you're on the phone, right? They say, have you got a pen and paper? They know you're not going to remember it. So you want to stay away from that. This idea of, you know, providing a quick reference, as with my Nat5 example, that's okay if I just want a short little bit of information, but still I can get a better coverage if I'm looking at a visual medium. Pinpointing is where we start to get interesting. So this is things like the weather example. Give me the weather in Melbourne tomorrow, and it gives me the answer straight back. And then doing is sort of really where voice has taken off. You know, the idea of home automation. I don't need to have a screen in front of me. I don't need to have a computer or anything like that. I can just be where I am. I can talk to the room and something happens. That's where voice really starts to become more effective than the existing channels. But we saw a little while ago that there was something else. There was an extension to this that sort of we weren't seeing in the market, but we predicted to happen. And that was this notion of what we call advancing. So it's really delivering an insight with this channel. So that voice assistant becomes a really intelligent friend that knows everything about you, knows everything about the information that you want to find out, and it can help you in a way that's quicker and more convenient, that you don't have to give all your attention to, and you can go back to doing whatever you were doing. And the notion about attention is an interesting one, actually, because we know from talking to users, we know from talking to the brands we work with and their customers, that a lot of the uptake for voice is based around screen fatigue. Right? That's a huge issue at the moment all over the world. And so people see voice as a way to sort of combat this. And you know, my statement about my son sort of talking to Google at the dinner table is actually not that uncommon. There's no way we'd allow iPads or phones at the dinner table. However, we're quite happy for him to interject, and we do it, and I do it all the time, is, you know, just we're talking about something, and oh, that's interesting. Oh, look, I wonder what, you know, more information about that. Ask Google, Google chimes in, and then we go back to our conversation. That's something we hear is really common in the market. But let's talk about this idea of advancing. So, as I mentioned, we didn't see many instances of this. So a little while ago, it's probably about 12 months ago, we created a bunch of demos across industries to sort of help people understand what this could do and the difference between something that was doing and something that was advancing. I'm going to give you an example from one of the prototypes we did for the financial services industry. I'm going to ask it two things. I'm going to ask it one which is traditionally asked, like an account balance, but then I'm going to ask it the bigger question. It's a question about affordability, and you'll hear how the utilization changes. Hey Google, talk to financial services demo.
Okay, let's get the test version of financial services demo.
Welcome to Deloitte Bank. I can tell you things like the current interest rate and answer your financial questions. What will it be?
What's my account balance?
Your account balance is today $15,324. Can I help you with anything else?
Can I afford a house in South Yarra?
Okay, the median house price in South Yarra is $1,700,000. Looking at your current account balance, if you save $2,375 each month, you could afford a 20% deposit on a house in South Yarra in 10 years. Can I help with anything else?
No thanks.
No problem. Thanks for using the Deloitte Bank voice assistant.
So there we go. That's always soul destroying. But it gets across that message, right? Like, I could have gone away and found all that information out myself. I could have used traditional channels. I could have gone to realestate.com.au and domain. I could have looked at my bank balance. I could have done the calculations myself. I could have worked all that out, but it would have taken me a lot of effort, and it would have taken me a lot of thinking. So where you can reduce cognitive load and mechanical load, voice becomes really, really useful. Now, I mentioned that there weren't many examples of this style of voice experience out there in the market, but recently a couple have come onto the market, and this is one of them.
Alexa, ask Call of Duty, how'd I do last match?
Let me break it down for you. You got clobbered. You were in last place on your team, and you collected a score of 25.
Okay, how do I improve my skills?
Use a grip to reduce recoil and help improve accuracy. Try Hustle for your basic training perk, and arm yourself with a lethal like a satchel charge.
Got it. What division should I use?
Now you're asking the right question, soldier. The ideal division for you is airborne.
Copy that. I'm going in.
So that's obviously very niche, and it's targeted at the video game market. But those principles are the ones that are going to drive sort of these experiences forward across any industry. So, personalized recommendations, using what you know about someone, about their previous interactions, and actually driving out recommendations and an experience that's unique to them, personalized to them. And so in this case, they've got an AI platform in the background that's using machine learning to look at everything that this player's done in this last game and compare it to everyone else who was in that game. And what did they do that was, gave them a better outcome than this person got? So you can see how that applies to a broad range of things, not just video games. But this is often where these technologies start. They start in the realms of entertainment, and in particular sort of technology, a lot of the time, let's be honest, pornography, and then they broaden out into wider use through the business world. So when it comes to sort of working out, okay, what's useful, what's going to be useful to your customers, how do you actually do this in a way that creates value? You've got to start with the research. Now, we're working with a brand at the moment, big household brand, who have identified that voice is a big part of their future. And they were doing it in a couple of different ways. They had a couple of experiences out there. None of them were performing well. They were all quite disparate. There was no common brand voice across them. And so they came to us and asked us to help with that. And what we did was we looked for a methodology that could be rolled out to help them understand what is valuable in voice and to help them sort of form this repeatable way of doing it so they could understand how to use it in their business. The reality is that didn't exist. They've got very deep reach into technology sort of industries across the world. We've got a variety of points of presence around the world. We sort of scoured pretty far and wide and it just didn't exist. So we actually built it with this brand. So we now have a way of identifying what's valuable for customers in this channel. What are the ways that we can test it over a period of a number of weeks? We tested 16 different ways that we could determine value for this, different customer research methods. So we now have a very clear understanding of how to do this. And these are sort of the key questions. How do customers talk about our products? You can't force people to say something. It's got to be something natural. It's got to be, sort of something you already have a bit of authority in. You'd be hard pressed to get someone to talk to Tide about financial advice, for example. It's just not going to make sense, and no one's going to do it. No matter how much you run a campaign of Tide can now tell you about your financial advice, it's just not going to happen, right? And the environment they're in is really important, particularly as voice rolls out. as we're walking around with these assistants in our ears, and that's going to happen before too long, you know, that's going to be quite relevant. Are you in a public space? Are you in your home? Are you in your car? In which case it's probably more private and you can have more of those private conversations. And then there's going to be ethical considerations around there. And the interesting thing for, you know, marketers is dealing with branding when it's not visual. Because a lot of, you know, the emphasis is on visual, it's on TV, it's on billboards, it's on, you know, placement in retail stores and packaging and everything. Less people focus on how the brand sounds, but that's something that's really going to need to change, you know, and we're starting to see things like ear cons, like, you know, those 3-tone identifiers that brands use, you know, like Intel, Telstra have got a good one. They're very common throughout the US with brands. We're starting to see them become more and more important. And also, you know, you've heard a few of the examples and you saw the video of the Alexa one. You don't have to use the pre-baked voices there. You can use your voice talent. You can use people that actually express the brand. It does, you know, have to be created in a slightly different way, but there are ways of still making that engaging and interactive. So that's going to be a really important question that everyone's going to have to answer. What does the brand sound like? And then if you've got a tone of voice for written content, how does that, you know, then lend itself to voice? How does it change? What kind of conversations do you have? Are you whimsical? You know, does your brand have license to be a bit cheeky, or do people expect you to be authoritative and just straightforward? So I'm conscious I've spoken about a lot, and I just wanted to finish by just giving you the takeaways that you can, you know, sort of take away from here and sort of action with yourself and your clients. Voice search, the front page is everything. So your SEO has never been more important. You've got to be on that front page if you're having any chance of being surfaced up by these devices. If you've already got that, then you should consider this short, concise question and answer format to go alongside your existing content to give the likes of Google and Amazon the signal that you're an authority in this area and that you can provide an answer to this question. And of course, there are search guidelines there that you can consult from Google. So I recommend you look them up if you're playing in this area at all. When it comes to creating branded apps, you've got to choose a use case that creates value. Keep it personalized if you can. And you know, you're designing for humans, so make sure you're testing with humans, make sure you're getting people's opinions on it. Yes, experiment, put things out there and learn, but experiment in a smart way. Don't just throw something out there, because there actually is a sort of a chance that you can do brand damage from that as well. And if you haven't picked it up, when it really comes down to you know, the heart of this conversation, it's all about design. It's sort of less about tech. I'm a technologist by trade, but I've barely mentioned it because it's all about design. And there's this field now that is sort of emerging that we call conversation design, which is where sort of UX and content merge. And you know, in fact, it requires people who are more adept at script writing than they are at writing traditional content. So we're going to start to see sort of those roles come up. We're already helping some people recruit for those roles. It's something we've been focusing on for the last sort of 18 months because we can see there's going to be the need for it. So, you know, this is something to be aware of. It's all about design. Don't get blinded by the tech. And I wanted to just wrap it up for you very neatly in the best way that I've seen. This comes out of Ireland, where a guy was sort of talking to his team about how do you help people understand where voice is useful and where it's not. And he came up with this: raw chicken moments. Right? And the notion for this is I can set a timer in a variety of different ways when I'm in the kitchen. I can set it on my phone, I can set it on an oven, I can set it on a dedicated kitchen timer, or I can use my voice for it. But in that moment when my hands are covered in raw chicken, voice becomes more convenient and far more higher utilization than any other channel. So if you can find those moments with your brands and your clients, then you're going to be well on the way to using voice really effectively. Thank you.